We're now 2 days after the Colorado Supreme Court made this ruling Tuesday night. 14th Amendment means that President Trump is ineligible to be on the ballot in 2024. They decided, and here we are still talking about it, even though things haven't actually moved forward yet. Is this all just playing in the former president's favor?
Well, you have to remember, every time the president has been indicted, if you've seen him in court, his poll numbers have gone up. So obviously he will continue to talk about this. He will continue to say that it's not fair and it's politically motivated. So at this point, the more that happens, the more he talks about it, seems to energize his base. We have seen that happening so far. Iowa will be a very good indication if any of this is playing a role at all. I mean, he's obviously well ahead in the polls here. It'll be interesting to see how far ahead he continues to be and if any of this affects the numbers at all.
Well, and Julie, to your point on Iowa, and keeping in mind that he is actively campaigning to be the president once again, all of his other opponents in that Republican primary race have essentially come out in support of him, saying that this should be left up to the voters, not the courts. They aren't using this as an opportunity to try and work against him. Do you expect that that's just going to continue?
Well, I expect it will continue for some time, especially throughout Iowa, because many of his opponents think that that will not help them at all, as they've seen so far with the numbers being where they are. Now, the question is where this goes from here. If there are more legal problems, if this happens in other states, at some point, they may have to decide what they want to do, especially if they remain so far behind in these polls.
Well, and as we're talking about how things move forward, Dan, to bring you in here, this is ultimately a lot of it going to be left basically to the Supreme Court, not just in this case in particular when it comes to the Colorado ruling, but as I mentioned earlier, the decision here in Washington regarding presidential immunity in the Jack Smith case. And there's 9 justices, as we know, on the court. One justice in particular, Clarence Thomas, is facing growing calls to recuse himself from these cases because of his wife, Ginny Thomas, and the role she played in these 2020 election efforts. Is this something that's likely to get more attention from Congress specifically, knowing already they have been pursuing this Clarence Thomas issue?
Absolutely. I mean, we've seen over the past year several stories about Justice Thomas from ProPublica and others looking at some of the influence that he may have come under as a result of some gifts that he's received from some wealthy individuals. So that's something that Congress is looking at and has had some interest in. And this is a very important case, obviously. So there's a bit of a convergence, I would say, between some of the scrutiny that Justice Thomas has already come under, plus the questions of how he would be potentially influenced by his wife, who was very involved in the Stop the Steal movement, texting with Chief of Staff Mark Meadows and various things like that. Whether he will actually recuse himself is another matter. Justice Thomas has not really commented on any of these controversies, and he has historically been very taciturn in many of these hearings. As we know, he's recently started to speak a little bit more. But will he recuse himself? That's really up to him, and there's no indication as of yet that he will.
Well, you mentioned this is something that Congress is looking into. Congress is also paying a close eye to what's happening when it comes to China. Of course, there was the NBC News report yesterday that Xi Jinping told Biden when they met last month that China intends essentially to reabsorb Taiwan. Then you had Senator Lindsey Graham promising sanctions from hell on China if they were indeed to move on Taiwan. All of this happening as we had news today that the Joint Chiefs of Staff Chair, C.Q. Brown, has actually spoken with his counterpart in Beijing. They are still trying to move this relationship forward. At the same time, there's talks of sanctions and additional tariffs. Just how hard is this line to walk for this administration? Yeah,
very complicated, to say the least. So on the question of sanctions, what we've seen with Russia and its invasion of Ukraine is that the U.S. Wants to move on sanctions with its partners and its allies. So it doesn't want to go it alone, or especially on something as sensitive as China. So it's going to try to build a coalition if there were to be economic sanctions. And I have seen and spoken to many people who say that the economic impact on the world economy of sanctions on China will be many times larger than that of sanctions on Russia. So it's a very delicate balance. Certainly, Senator Graham has a point of view, and there have been some war games and things worked out between the administration and others as they've tried to think through this issue, but it's a very sensitive issue. The tariffs is an interesting thing because it's sort of attempting to stop short of obviously full-on sanctions or something very hurtful like that.
Right.
But get at this question of electric vehicles and semiconductors and all of these things that the U.S. wants to develop here. In the event that there is some sort of economic sanctions on China, that we will have at least that kind of technology, to a certain extent here in the U.S. or with our partners and allies.
It's definitely very difficult. And Julie, when we're talking about what Senator Graham had to say about this, just given the continuing rhetoric and messaging we've heard from Congress, it seems that most on both sides of the aisle kind of agree with him, at least in terms of general sentiment. This might be the one thing everybody can agree on in Washington is hawkish on China.
Exactly. And since it's the one thing they agree on, they will be more than willing to talk about it. Congress is facing tough questions right now as it comes to the budget. For Republicans, the former president, they have to talk about Israel. They need to talk about Ukraine. So talking about China, this is an easy one for people in Congress and likely one they'll be happy to take questions about.